as today's episode opens, we turn our attention to Europe in a chapter that I have needlessly confused everyone about by asking you to read two chapters, one of which is not in your book. Which I thought even for me that is just sort of more negligence than I'm accustomed to. I'll tell you what the story is. The entire book, The Earth and Its People, in the fourth brief edition, has 30 chapters. So it divides in the middle with 15 chapters in each half of the book. But the split that they've published into a volume 1 and a volume 2 divides 14-16 rather than 15-15. So over the weekend, as I was looking up the comprehensive version that I have at home, I saw, oh, I've come up a chapter short. And I intemperately sent out a request that you read an additional chapter, and then checked in my office and discovered that, oh, in the volume 1 version, there are only 14 chapters. So the exam's going to be on that unread chapter. Clearly, it's. But there was a good reason to link the two, because it gets into an issue that has been central to the enterprise of world history, in at least the American version of it, pretty much from the beginning, and that is the question of what do you do about Europe, the 800-pound continent in the room. And the slogan to provincialize Europe has been there, to try and treat Europe as if it were like any other part of the world. Yet recognizing that surely that will be very difficult to do because, first of all, so much seems to have happened that centered on or began in Europe, and because the weight of the library of history books that have been written in Western languages is vastly preponderant in the European area. But in this book, The Earth and Its Peoples, up to chapter 13, we have done, I think, a fairly good job of keeping some sort of perspective on the importance of different parts of the world. We may have picked some awkward comparisons or used some bridging rubrics like tropics that don't necessarily persuade you very much. But Europe was kind of, kept in a cage. We did not spend a lot of time on aspects of European history that in a traditional Western Civ book or in general in earlier phases of teaching history in American and universities would have given more weight to it. But now we come to the question of Europe, and it's particularly accentuated in this chapter because the title of the chapter is Latin Europe. There was a substantial debate within the author team about whether we should have a chapter entitled Latin Europe as opposed to simply Europe with some sort of feel-good term to it, like, not quite modern Europe or something like that. And the author insisted that there was so much that had to be written about Latin Europe that you could catch up on other parts of Europe at a later point. So we ended up with a chapter entitled Latin Europe. The extension of that chapter almost, it just flows on, is in the chapter that you don't have in volume 1, and that is called European Transformations, where you just continue the story of European history, Western European history, although in the European transformations you have a little more about parts of Europe other than England, France, Italy, and Spain, which is really the core of Western European or Latin European history as conceived in this chapter. If you go back and you look at earlier comments about Europe in the book or in any other book, you find questions about what is Europe? How do you define Europe? The classical definition, of course, was one that situated Greece in Europe, and as soon as you crossed the Hellespont into Asia Minor, you were now in Asia Minor. You weren't in Europe anymore, and so we still have this notion that the city of Istanbul is divided between two continents. There's a European Istanbul and an Asian Istanbul. You go there, people talk about the Asian side and the European side, as if they weren't, two sides of pretty much the same very narrow body of water, more alike than different. You sort of like taking Minneapolis and St. Paul and saying you have two continents separated by the Mississippi River. It's not very persuasive. And it's particularly not persuasive because when we think of the Greeks and the Greek oikoumene, the world, the known world in the minds of the Greeks, we tend to think of it from the point of view of Athens. All those smart Athenians. But in fact, the books that we go to look at this Greek world were more often than not written by Greeks living in Ionia, that is to say, along the Aegean shore, the eastern shore of the Aegean in what is now Turkey. Because even though you have a technical division between a European continent, which has Greece in it, and an Asian continent that does not have Greece in it, nevertheless you had lots of Greeks living in Asia. Very likely more Greeks living in Asia than you had living in southeastern Europe. And certainly when you look at the library of famous Greek authors, you find Greeks from Ionia playing a terribly important role. And this, of course, goes all the way up to the beginnings of Christianity, where so many of the letters of St. Paul are written to congregations in Asia, even though they were Greek-speaking congregations receiving letters written in Greek. So the purely technical definition of Europe as distinguished from Asia through the body of water that we now see separating parts of the city of Istanbul never seemed like a very solid thing to base something on. What appears to have happened by the time you get to chapter 13 is that Europe has come to be defined as being a place where Christians are. And non-Europe is a place where there are no Christians. Not at all. There are lots of Christians in non-Europe. It's just that the rulers aren't Christians. So it isn't even a matter of a one religion on one side and one religion on another. You have a fairly consistent Christianity throughout the area that comes to be defined as Europe in these later chapters. But you have lots of Christians living outside of Europe, including in all of the Muslim-ruled countries around the Mediterranean. But this chapter narrows it down further to being Latin Europe. By narrowing it to Latin Europe, space is made available to talk about things like the Renaissance and Renaissance humanism, changes in techniques of painting, and conflicts such as the 100 Years' War between England and France. I would submit that the 100 Years' War between England and France could probably be completely deleted from the book without significantly damaging the notion of world history. Why this particular conflict is given, let's say, as much space as the entire history of Korea or something. It sort of beggars the imagination, except for the fact that there are certain stories that people who were brought up on Western history feel really should be there. For example, Joan of Arc. Surely we need to have the story of Joan of Arc. We actually don't need to have the story of Joan of Arc. We don't have to know that longbows were used at the Battle of Agincourt or that cannon were used at the Battle of Crécy. These are technological changes in warfare that alter the balance between two countries on the northwestern rim of Europe. But in the broader scope of world history, do they really amount to very much? Now here is where you get the problem that is faced by world history textbook writers, not just in our team, but in general. How much of the sort of golden treasury of stories of the European past can you discard without really irritating the users? The first time I was involved in a world history text, one that was never published, I had a colleague who was in charge of the project who was a very, very expert storyteller, wonderful American historian named Jack Garrity. And I wrote about the Battle of Marathon. And I said, after the Battle of Marathon, a Greek named Philippides or Pheidippides ran from the battlefield of Marathon to the city of Athens and announced that the Athenians had won a great victory against the Persians, and then he expired because of the arduousness of this run. And Jack said something to the effect of, our students today, their mothers run the marathon and then go home and cook a meal. Who's going to believe that somebody is going to drop dead after running 26 miles? And, do we tell this old story? So I thought, well, I better look into the story. So I read Herodotus, reread it, and found he doesn't tell the story of the run from Marathon. It appears in a much later work called De Lapsu ad Salutandum, meaning the book of those people who collapse after giving salutations. Because this is a literary trope, Hail Caesar, that sort of thing. And it appears it's a late story, it doesn't show up in Herodotus. On the other hand, there is a guy with a similar name in Herodotus who ran from Marathon to Sparta to beg the Spartans to come to the aid of the Athenians. And the Spartans said, we're praying now, and we won't be done for a few days, so we can't help you. So he ran back from Sparta to Marathon. And if he was the same guy who then ran 26 miles from Marathon to Athens, then he had run something like 350 miles in a week. And, lots of people will die after that. Nevertheless, it raised the question in my mind as to what stories warrant retelling. Is there any list Years ago, there was an effort to push something called cultural literacy. There was a book published on this topic that had a list of those things that every cultured person should know. And this was to be used as a basis for high school education. So people, when they graduate from high school, should be able to take a test on cultural literacy and see whether they have learned what is in their culture. I happen to be on the review committee of the National Endowment for the Humanities when the project came up. I spent about an hour and a half trying to shoot the project down. I said, this assumes that everyone in the classroom shares the same culture. And this was back in the days when Lynn Cheney was head of the NEH. And people said, well, don't they share the same culture? Aren't all Americans American? And don't they all know who Joan of Arc is? And so forth and so on. And ultimately the project was funded, and ultimately it led absolutely nowhere. Although perhaps it did help some people do New York Times crossword puzzles. I'm not sure. But there is this lingering notion that there are certain things that everybody should know at the level of anecdotes, of stories, as opposed to at the grander level of peoples, nations, empires, major changes in the economy and technology and social structure, in political philosophy and so forth. We have left out most stories in this book, often with regret, because we do not have the space in a world history text to put in all the stories that would be good to tell. But when you narrow a chapter down to only dealing with Latin Europe for a period of 300 years, it becomes possible for you to tell the stories. And that's fine. This is a chapter that mentions Petrarch and Dante and Boccaccio, and if you're a Columbia student, you have some notion of who these people are because we have a core curriculum that preserves the notion that we should all have a common culture. But most people in this country do not know who Petrarch was or Boccaccio, although they may know a little more about Dante. But these stories are in this chapter. Now, so the question I would raise is, at what cost? And is it edifying from the standpoint of world history to be offered a group of names and anecdotes that are particular to Western history that arguably may not have much of a world historical impact, such as the use of the longbow at the Battle of Agincourt? Not much of a world historical impact there. For artists like Leonardo da Vinci or Michelangelo, or for a figure like Dante, the argument would be made by many people in humanities that there are certain thinkers, writers, artists whose work is so transcendent in its self-evident importance that it should be part of world culture. And I want you to think a little bit about what the notion of a world culture would be. The United Nations fosters the notion of a world culture, and UNESCO has a whole group of about 800 world cultural sites, and they're distributed very broadly throughout all of the continents, with a very conscious idea of that that these world cultural sites, world historical sites should be, should not focus upon a single area. But if you were to look not at sites like the pyramids or the Great Wall of China or the Incan cities in the Andes, if you weren't to look at sites which have the unique capacity or the unique quality of not being movable, but if you were to look at things that are mobile, such as images or text, then there'd be the question of should there be or could there be a set of world cultural images and texts? And if so, is Michelangelo more deserving of mention than some Chinese artist or Indian artist or Muslim artist or some nameless artist who produced a masterpiece of bronze casting in West Africa or ceramic art in Central America? What would constitute world cultural excellence? And would these Western texts be in it? It's a vexing question. Here at Columbia for years we have had debates over great texts and great cultural monuments, and we have had a curriculum that focuses upon those in the Western tradition, and the debate has been over how and to what degree and what manner could one globalize this notion of great images and great texts on a world cultural basis. One of the solutions to this problem that came up in the 1950s was a notion that the great thinkers of the world exist in a kind of Platonic, invisible life of the absolutes in which they hold a conversation. So that you can imagine, Freud in conversation with Kant, in conversation with Mohammed, in conversation with, Fu Manchu, whatever. It's the idea that there's some sort of great interaction. You can say, well, we're talking today about Adam Smith, but how does that compare with what Aristotle said? And there you are, you're a freshman or a first year, and you think, I can't remember at this point anything Aristotle said about anything, and much less anything that would relate to Adam Smith. And so this idea of a great conversation was developed. It came to a head in the Syntopicon, which was a great effort to identify all the themes of culture, angels, evil, dog food, whatever, and give text references to everyone who had mentioned these things. But it really didn't work very well. Because inevitably what happened was that the Western authors were taken as the benchmark and everyone else is compared to them. And say, in what way is X, Y, or Z like Kant in his thinking, or unlike Kant in his thinking? The only course that attempted to take works of completely different cultures, read them in the class in translation, and try and get into sort of a dialogue, was one taught for a number of years by the former provost of Columbia, Theodore DeBerry, and it was a thematically organized course that had separate sections on East Asia, South Asia, Middle East, and Europe. or Euro-America. And there were efforts to, for a number of years, every spring there was a seminar that faculty would go to who were interested in transcultural or intercultural conversation. It was very difficult. It was very difficult to read a Sufi poem from Eastern India and compare it with, let us say, a mystic work from Latin Europe. And I think the whole enterprise of thinking in terms of a world culture, that at the level of texts and images, needs a lot more work. How to do it and how to make it in any way work in an integrated fashion, I think is unclear to me, even though I taught in that course with Ted DeBerry for 5 years. I was never convinced that you could do this sort of transcultural, intellectual, and artistic conversation. But in this chapter, the mention of famous writers and famous artists is secondary to other sorts of events. In keeping with the theme of the book on technology and environment, you have discussions of urban life, discussions of technological change, discussions of changes in warfare, and so forth, all legitimate topics. But what you don't have is a very clear justification for talking about Latin Europe. We argued with the author, that is to say I and other people in the author team, argued with the author of this chapter on the restriction to Latin Europe. And he was adamant, and it was his chapter, so we did it his way. But now that I read the chapter with some attentiveness, I'm struck by the stuff that was left out. In particular, the failure to mention anything about the Ottoman Empire. Here you have a state that is a European state. There can be no question of that. The Black Death of 1348 caused a number of tumultuous changes. One of the less known ones is that a year or two later, Turkish warriors from the small state known as by the name of its founder, Osman, crossed the water boundary between Asia and Europe and became the founders of a new state, which was primarily a European state. In other words, Osman we understand him to be a ruler in the northwest corner of Asia Minor, of Anatolia. Incidentally, this name derives from the Arabic name Othman, which is the name of the third caliph. And if you were an Italian and you couldn't pronounce a TH, and certainly you could not pronounce the Ain with which the name begins, Uthman becomes Ottoman. And then you put on a suffix Ottomano and you have Ottoman. So that Ottoman comes from Osman by way of Arabic, and it shows the degree to which the whole knowledge of what was happening in Southeast Europe was filtered through an Italian sensibility, and that it was the Italian merchants, seafarers, who become preeminent in the Mediterranean from the 12th century onward, that become the people who know the most. Of the Italians, the most knowledgeable of the Italians among the Italians were the Venetians. And somehow Venice is virtually unmentioned in this chapter. Venice and Genoa, but more Venice than Genoa, develop very extensive trading relations with the Muslims in Egypt and the Muslims in Asia Minor, and then when the Ottoman Empire is established in the course of the later 1300s, Venice is their main rival, and you have a war between the Ottomans and the Venetians that's at least as long as the war between the French and the English, known as the 100 Years' War. But you can't talk about Venice without talking about the Ottoman Empire. So we get lots about Florence, because that's sufficiently far west to Florence and Rome. But Venice, which shares at least as much as any other major Italian city in the glories of the Renaissance, barely gets mentioned. The Ottomans set up a state in southeastern Europe. They do not really begin to penetrate further into the Islamic Middle Eastern areas until after 1400. 1380. It's a little bit before 1400. But their first effort to set up a major state is in Southeast Europe against the Serbians and the Greeks and other people living there. So one of the things about the Ottoman state from the very beginning is that most of the subjects of the Ottoman Sultan are not Muslims. They're mostly Christians. So if you were to have written a chapter on Christian Europe, then you have to include the Ottomans, because Christian Europe includes all those Christians that were living under Ottoman rule in the Balkans and in the Greek peninsula. But the insistence of this chapter is on Latin Europe, even to the extent of having a map that grossly falsifies things by showing the growth of Latin Europe and showing that Latin Europe increases by almost a third with the adoption of Christianity in Lithuania. How many people know anything about Lithuanian Christianity? It's not a popular subject, but if you look at the Lithuanian state, which was actually a Lithuanian-Polish commonwealth, which did cover a huge area of Eastern Europe, one of the things you find was that at least half the population were not Latin Christians, because this is an area that included the Ukraine, it included Belarus, it included Moldova, it included substantial areas that were Orthodox Christian. But the map we have in the Earth and Its Peoples awards all of this to Latin Christianity. Why didn't I notice that 4 editions ago? I feel so stupid to have let that pass, because it creates a notion of the all-powerful force of Catholicism, which is not really warranted. And of course, it also means that if you don't include Eastern Europe, you are missing the areas in which you have the most intriguing and fertile interrelationship among groups. In other words, you look at the Ottoman Empire of southeastern Europe, and you see Christians and Muslims living in a state governed by an Ottoman Sultan who is a Muslim. After 1492, this becomes the paramount location for Jews who are expelled from Spain by all those lovely Latin Christians to find refuge. So the Ottoman Empire becomes the primary locus of the Spanish Jewish communities who had been accustomed in Muslim Iberia to having civil and indeed often creative interaction with Muslims and Christians. They come to the Ottoman Empire, where in fact that creative interaction to some degree continues. So the Ottoman Empire is mixed ethnically, it's mixed linguistically, it's mixed religiously. Things that are really outside the worldview of the Latin Christians in Western Europe. When we think of the ruling class of the Ottoman Empire, we think of them as speaking a language known as Ottoman, or in Turkish you would say Osmanlı. But that language was a highly refined language based on Turkish grammar with huge admixtures of Arabic and Persian. That makes it very difficult for people today to learn. But it was a hallmark of the learned elite of the Ottoman Empire that they actually knew, as a standard cultural background, 3 languages: Persian, Arabic, and Turkish. I point out that those 3 languages all belong to different language families. It's as if, it's often pointed out, Europeans know many languages, but the European languages are basically all dialects of one another. Gee, I know Swedish, Dutch, and German. Yeah, jawohl. I mean, that's, does that qualify as turning you into a polymath? Is it the same thing as knowing, Dutch, Telugu, and Tagalog? Well, no. I mean, not many people will know those 3, but lots of Europeans will know more than one. But in the Ottoman Empire, the upper class normally knew 3 languages from 3 different language families. It was an elite drawn from all of the communities, in the religious communities and the ethnic communities in the empire, and it produced a remarkably well-organized and successful state under the Ottoman Sultan. In the textbook that I am co-author of, there is a single paragraph devoted to the Ottomans prior to this chapter, and no discussion of the Ottomans in this chapter. And by the end of the chapter, you have gotten up to 1500, and the Byzantine Empire has disappeared because the Ottomans conquered it. Southeast Europe has been swallowed up by the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire is the greatest enemy imaginable for most Christian Europeans by the year 1500, and yet it isn't mentioned. This is a fault.
Is it mentioned in the next chapter?
It is not mentioned in the next chapter, because the next chapter is on, which we'll have next week, is on the maritime expansion of Europe, primarily. Although we do, sort of wave our hats at the Polynesians and a few others who sail around. And in the chapter after that, the mysterious chapter that isn't in the book, that's called European Transformations. And there is a reference to the Ottoman Wars. But there's no description of the Ottoman Wars or of the state against which the Ottoman Wars were fought. So you've already gone through the Ottoman Wars up to 1750 before the Ottoman Empire is discussed in the book. This is bad thinking. What were these authors thinking about? If only I knew. It's very puzzling. But many of the things that you could say about the Ottoman Empire were distinctive in a somewhat different fashion about the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which is coming around at the same time a little bit later. We mentioned Lithuania in opposition to the Mongols in an earlier chapter. That is where we have the paragraph on the Ottomans. But we don't say what is distinctive about Lithuania. The implication is that Lithuania is a national state that galvanizes its national identity in opposition to the Mongol threat. But there's nothing there to intimate that the Poles and the Lithuanians, who speak distinctly different languages, would come together in a single state, nor that that state would not have a hereditary king, but rather would elect its king, nor that the election of the king would require unanimous votes on the part of the entire nobility, which constituted 10% of the population. And the nobility drawn from every ethnic and religious group in the country. When they would get together for a political convention to choose a new king, it might last for 6 or 9 months and encompass some local civil wars in order to persuade people to vote the right way. Eventually, a king would come along, and the king normally could not pass his crown on to a successor. Poland and Lithuania were religiously strikingly neutral. It was almost, a perfect example of separation of church and state. So you not only had every form of Christian in it, of the nobility, about 40% were Greek Orthodox, about 40% were Latins, and then there was another 20% who were other things. You had Muslims who were completely integrated in the state. To this day, there is a small community of people in Lithuania known as the Lithuanian Tatars, who are the descendants of Muslims who lived in that Lithuanian state and played a respected role in the polity. When the Protestant Reformation comes along, which technically is outside the purview of this chapter, every Protestant denomination seems to be tolerated and represented in Lithuania, Poland, and in the wars of religion between Catholics and Protestants, there is no participation by Lithuania. They remain aloof to all of the wars of religion between Catholics and Protestants. They say religion is not what we fight over here in Lithuania. And eventually they produce a constitution, which is the world's second constitution after the US Constitution. 1792 is the Lithuanian Constitution. It manages to offend the elites so profoundly that it only lasts for 4 years, and then the entire country is ripped apart and distributed and passes out of existence for 100 years. But that's way in the future. My point is that when you read about Latin Europe, you find a certain, not only a collection of well-known names and stories, but a certain narrowness that is taken as represented as the primary characteristic of these Europeans. Since the expansion of Europe in maritime exploration comes in a different chapter, you don't see a balance between the interior developments and the foreign overseas adventures, which would be desirable. You have a section in the chapter that talks about the formation of centralized kingdoms. Well, of course, there is no kingdom more centralized than the Ottomans. If this had been conceived of as a chapter on geographical Europe between 1200 and 1500, so that the Ottomans were included, and so that the Iberian Peninsula became not simply an area of Christian reconquest, but it included very substantial and important cultural developments that occurred in the Iberian Peninsula before the Christian reconquest. Then you would have a very different story indeed. And you would have a wonderful contrast. In other words, we were willing to contrast Rome and Han China, but to contrast, say, the Ottoman Empire with the Holy Roman Empire or France or Britain or all three in a sack in some way, that would be a very different and very interesting chapter. And we didn't do that. What might happen if you did it? The Europeans, down to pretty much through the 18th century, considered the Ottoman Empire a serious realm comparable to the European realms. In other words, the notion that the word Europe should exclude the East and the Southeast was not was not understood by European observers prior to the 19th century. Indeed, you can take a humanist like Erasmus, who looked on Poland, Lithuania as the ideal state, which we don't really read about very often. But in looking at the Ottomans, what the Europeans saw was a superiority of organization that they found intriguing and challenging and dangerous. So that the fear of the Ottomans was not simply a fear of their military successes, which were many, but also a fear of the effectiveness of their institutions. This has become a great debating point among Ottoman historians. That is to say, the Ottoman Empire expands and expands and then stops expanding. And there the question has been raised, did it stop expanding because it had reached a natural limit? That is, say, the city of Vienna is the most obvious point in Europe, because in 1529, the first of two Ottoman sieges of Vienna took place, and the Ottomans failed to take the city. So they never got past Vienna. So one school of thought would say that Vienna was too far away from Istanbul. That if you started your campaigning season by marching your army from Istanbul to the frontier to fight the Christians, by the time you got to the frontier, you would be so far into the summer and into the fall that you could only fight for a few days before you had to turn around and go back home in order to avoid the bad weather of winter. And this does play upon the fact that there were weather factors affecting the first siege of Vienna, particularly in preventing the Ottomans from bringing their artillery up by river transport. Nevertheless, there was nothing to have prevented the Ottomans from stationing an army near Vienna and simply starting from the army camp instead of from Istanbul. But I think when historians in recent times have tried to say that the Ottoman Empire had a natural limit, that once they reached that limit, they could not grow anymore, there's an implicit comparison being made with European states that created maritime empires seemingly that had no limit. In other words, for the French or the British or the Spaniards or the Portuguese or the Dutch to expand their reach through imperial enterprise, you don't get much discussion of the idea that, well, maybe there is a certain maximum number of colonies that you can have. Maybe beyond a certain point, the empire couldn't grow anymore. Rather, you have the idea that a properly run empire can grow and grow and grow. So the Ottomans seem to be Muslims who are limited in their capacities to expand, whereas Europeans are not limited. But that's a historical interpretation. There are other interpretations as to why the Ottomans did not expand beyond where they got to, beyond Vienna. And those interpretations often have to do with just the complexity of running large states and the question of what is the purpose of expansion, whether there are other ways to deploy state resources than military expansion. We'll see this next week in talking about the Chinese expeditions to Africa by sea. You know, huge expeditions that sailed across the Indian Ocean and then stopped. Was there a reason for their stopping? Well, it might have to do with how much investment it was taking to launch those expeditions. But be that as it may, the Ottoman Empire fascinated the Europeans. And what fascinated them as much as anything was a specific cultural institution that the Ottomans had. That was known as the Dev-Shirmeh. The Dev-Shirmeh was a procedure for selecting boy children to be trained to serve the state. They could serve the state as soldiers, and if they served the state as soldiers, they became members of the Janissary Corps. But they could also serve the state as commanders and as administrators. The general term for a person who was taken in the Dev-Shirmeh was kapakulu, kapı meaning the gate, and kul being a Turkish word for slave. It is the same as the word coolie that the British picked up in India from the terminology of the Mughal Empire for laborers in Mughal India. So the slave of the gate was a person who was selected by the ruling establishment, trained either for military service or for the most talented people for higher levels of administration, and to a substantial degree, though not completely by any means, they provided the elite, the rulers of the Ottoman Empire, not the sultans, but even up to the level of the Grand Vizier. That person could be someone who started life as born into a Christian family in Serbia or Albania or Bosnia, and was taken at the age of 7 into government service, trained, rose through the ranks, became an administrator, rose to the administration, and eventually becomes the chief administrator of the empire. Now, there are certain interesting things about this institution. One of them, of course, is that this is not a Muslim institution. In order to be put in the category of being a kul, of being a slave, you could not be a Muslim, at least theoretically. Muslims cannot enslave other Muslims. Therefore, you had to come from a religious background that was non-Muslim. So most of the people who were in the category of kapakolu were from Christian families, which means that the the ruling elite of the Ottoman Empire, pretty much from the very beginning, even before the Devshirme system, when you had certain eminent Christian families who worked with the Ottomans in their conquest and administration. Pretty much from the very beginning, the Ottoman Empire is ruled by people from Muslim and Christian backgrounds and from different ethnic backgrounds. The Janissaries were placed in a separate military contingent that commanded the admiration of military men throughout Europe because they were so effective. They were the first regular military formation to use hand-carried gunpowder weapons. This required that they be infantry because the weapons of that time were so heavy that you could not really fire them from horseback. So the cavalry portion of the Ottoman Empire came from Turkish tribal or quasi-tribal families in Anatolia and Asia Minor, whereas the infantry largely came from soldiers of Christian origin who were born in Southeast Europe. The effectiveness of their weapons was perhaps less important than the effectiveness of their organization and the strictness of their discipline. They lived in barracks. They were not permitted to marry. They were not permitted to engage in business. They could not pass their position in the military on to their offspring. They were dedicated protectors of the Ottoman state. You think, where did I read about the idea that there might be certain selected people who were dedicated protectors of the state? It was in Plato's Republic, where he talks about the watchdogs, the class of people, the guardians, who will be the ones that protect the state. And they will be selected because for their natural qualities. You know, you can know who is supposed to be a guardian because they will have certain qualities. When the Ottomans sent out not recruiting, but selection committees to go to these villages, they would bring together all the boys, and they would say, well, you're too short, you're too skinny, you're too fat, you look stupid, but these guys over here, we'll take them. So it really was a selection. And it was based on the idea that there were natural qualities that would be apparent in these boys. Then they were brought up, and they were kept innocent of money, innocent of family, innocent of engagement with society. They are simply there to be the guardians of the state. It is almost a pure play out of Plato's Republic. No one, to my knowledge, has ever proposed this in a serious written work. No one has ever said, I think somebody in the Ottoman elite must have read Plato's Republic and thought about how do we implement this ideal state. You think, well, the Ottomans are Muslims, they speak Turkish. No, but we've already established that among the elite of the Ottoman Empire from the very beginning, there were Greek, not only people who read and spoke Greek, but they were Greek. And they were not Muslims. In other words, this wasn't a religious thing. It's entirely possible that Plato's Republic was used as a model. We know from a reference in Ibn Rushd in Spain at the time of the rise of the Ottoman Empire that he had seen a translation of Plato's Republic into Arabic. We don't have any trace of that translation. But we do know that Plato's Republic was a known work. So the question of whether the Ottomans were in some, either at second or maybe first or second or third hand, living out a vision of a state concocted by Europeans rather than a vision of the state concocted by the Prophet Muhammad, would be something that you could bring out if you wrote a chapter on Europe, rather than taking it as an assumption that everything Muslim is to be separated from everything Christian. There is a term that's used more generally to talk about the Ottoman Empire, not so much used now as in previous scholarship. It's called Byzance après Byzance, which means Byzantium after Byzantium. And the idea was that the Ottoman Empire, which brings the Byzantine Empire to an end in 1453, but which has been ruling over most Byzantine territory for 75 years before that time. The idea that the Byzantine Empire lives on in the Ottoman Empire because of the wholesale adoption of Greek Byzantine practices, customs, food recipes, costume, everything else. That used to be a more popular idea than it is now. And a lot of this gets wrapped up in the nationalistic biases of Turkish historiography, where it would not be particularly sound for a Turkish historian to say, whatever we are, we owe to the Greeks. This would not be a good thing to do. And I don't mean by any means to belittle the sensibilities here. I was teaching a class years ago in contemporary civilization, and when we read Plato's Republic, I commented on how the Ottoman Empire seemed to have brought certain aspects of Plato's Republic into being. And a Greek student in the class made me fear for my life. He said that the Turks are, murdering oppressors, and nothing that is honored by the name Greek could ever be conceived of by a Turk. I don't think one can casually dismiss this sort of thing, because what we have today throughout Eastern Europe is one after another a panoply of nationalist theorizing that demonizes the Ottomans or demonizes the Turk. Now, the Ottomans, more often than not, simply referred to as the Turk, regardless of whether the people who were actually doing the fighting on the Ottoman side were Serbs or Albanians or Vlachs or Greeks or whatever. The poisonous character of this nationalist theorizing, I don't think can be readily dismissed. It is simply too deep. The truth of the matter is, what do I know about truth? Hopefully the siren will cover that up. There are about 14 European countries that have been ruled by Muslim regimes in toto or in part for over 100 years in their history. In other words, Islamic rule has been extremely common in the history of Europe. But in the history of Europe that we tell in this chapter, the Muslims do not appear except as vanquished enemies of the bold Christian warriors in Spain and Portugal. And this, I think, is where our textbook is part of the problem rather than part of the solution. The only country that has really come to grips with its Muslim past in Europe is Spain. And that was a political as well as or perhaps even more than, an intellectual enterprise. This is a change of view that is associated with the end of the Franco regime and the positioning of Spain by more recent governments to be the interlocutor between the Muslim world and Europe. It wasn't natural necessarily for the Spaniards to say, oh, we've really gotten along so well, we Christians and Jews, well actually no Jews left, but we Christians and Muslims, well there are no Muslims left, but you know, during those years when we let the Jews and the Muslims be in Spain, we really got along really well with them until we either killed them or drove them out. That there's something somewhat spurious to this. But you have created the notion that there was a unique moment in history when Christians, Jews, and Muslims got along. And this was in Spain before, but even during the period of the Christian reconquest. The term used is a convivencia, living together. Some people would like to expand the notion of convivencia and talk about how do we live together today? And it's become a kind of a political term. But historically, you probably had just as much living together of Christians, Jews, and Muslims in the Ottoman Empire as you had in Spain. It's just that you can't readily talk about it because of the political sensitivities. When you have people from half a dozen European countries who have been brought up to believe that every single moment of Ottoman rule was a moment of terror, oppression, torture, and villainy that destroyed the fortunes of the nation and stole the young men who would have made the nation great if they had not been drafted into the Ottoman army. So, to my mind, what I would like to see world history books do, and I would like to see our book do in its next edition, is to look at Europe in this period as a whole, to include Eastern Europe, to include Southeastern Europe, to include the Ottoman Empire, and to do a kind of comparison between what you had in Latin Europe and what you had in other parts of Europe, and see to what degree there is something European here, as opposed to accepting a priori the notion that the boundary between Christian and Muslim is a fixed and an immutable boundary. So when you have a section, as you have in this chapter, that talks about the vicious atrocities against Jews perpetrated by Christians at the time of the Black Death, it might be valuable to say, well, in other parts of Europe, Jews were well received after 1492 and led productive and prosperous lives under Muslim rule. So I guess what I'm doing here is making a plea to the unknown authors of this book to revisit their table of contents One possibility would be to go back and revisit that chapter on the Mongols and say, was it right to view the Mongols as the center against which everybody else, to which everybody else reacted? Was it right to say that the Mongol threat was the formation of Japan, or the Mongol overlordship was the formation of Russia, or the Mongol peril was the rationale for the Mamluk state in Egypt? Was it right to portray a great conquering force of unquestioned power and competence as being the formative influence? In which case the Ottomans turn into, like the Lithuanians, they turn into just a paragraph in the context of the Mongol impact. Or would it have been better to have reserved some of this impact for discussion in a different context? And I would suggest in this context here. So how to repair the decision to exclude the Mongols from this chapter may not be a matter of simply rewriting this chapter, which I'd be perfectly happy to do, but a matter of reconceiving a sequence of chapters, and in the process to readdress or to address explicitly something that was only implicit, which is, what is Europe? You know, what is Europe? It is not at all clear that understandings of Europe, I mean, people continually for the last 100 years have said, what is the Middle East? Where is the Middle East? What is it in the middle of? What is it east of? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. As if that's a problematic area and that Europe is just a given. Well, no. All of these areas are constructions, intellectual constructions. And they all deserve to be interrogated. And I think Europe is the one where we have, as of the 5th edition, not done a sufficient job of interrogating the units that we are using for laying out this history of the world. And on Thursday, I will talk about something else.